I had been driving along old back roads outside Scranton that autumn afternoon. The kind of roads lined with pockmarked asphalt and trees that were just beginning to burn bright orange and red at their edges. I had read about the quarry somewhere online, a place locals whispered about as if it was a secret only the daring or foolish would seek. They said monster trout lived in the deep water, fish so large and aggressive that even the occasional fisherman who tried to land one came back shaken and empty-handed. I didn't care much about the size of the fish. I just wanted to see if the stories were true, to feel that edge of danger that came from being somewhere abandoned and wild, even if it was just water and rocks. I parked my car at the edge of the overgrown dirt path leading to the quarry, grabbed my small, single-person kayak, and slung it down toward the water. The quarry was worse than I had imagined, not in ugliness, but in isolation. The cliffs around it rose straight up, gray and bare, pocked with old drill holes, and their shadows stretched across the water, turning the surface nearly black. The light was fading as the sun dipped behind the trees on the ridge, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and fallen leaves. There was no wind, no birds, no sound except my own careful footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the cliffside. I slid the kayak into the water, the plastic scraping softly against the muddy shore, and climbed in, feeling the water rock slightly beneath me. It was colder than I expected, and I could see down a few feet before the murky darkness swallowed the view. The surface was unnaturally smooth like glass, reflecting the cliffs and the gray sky. I paddled toward the center where the water dropped off into its deepest part, letting the kayak glide almost silently. My line was ready, the lure tied and baited, and I cast it far out, the motion precise, the lure sinking into the shadowed water. I let it sit and watched ripples fade across the surface. For several minutes, nothing moved. I focused on the water, listening to the small sounds of the quarry. The distant rustle of leaves, a bird calling somewhere high in the trees, the soft slap of water against the kayak. My heart was steady, almost calm. I told myself this was normal, that it was quiet because the place was abandoned, that there were no monsters here, just fish. Then something changed. The water shifted abruptly, as if a hand had stirred it from below. A small wave ran along the surface toward me, and I felt the kayak rock under my legs. At first, I thought it was a school of fish, maybe large trout, breaking the surface. But the movement wasn't like anything I had seen before. There was no jumping or splashing, just a deep, rolling pressure beneath the water, as if something massive had shifted in the depths. My gut tightened. I gripped the paddle tighter and leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed on the black water. Then, without warning, the kayak jolted violently to the side. A hard thump hit against the hull, enough to throw me off balance. I braced with my arms and knees, heart hammering, feeling the cold water slap against my hands and thighs. It wasn't a current. It wasn't wind. It was something in the water, something enormous that had brushed against the kayak with force. My stomach sank, and I realized I was completely alone at the bottom of a steep cliff, with nothing between me and the unseen weight beneath the surface. I started paddling. I didn't know where to go, only that I had to reach the shore. Each stroke was frantic, my muscles burning, the kayak tipping slightly as the water pressed against it from below. I could feel the disturbance in the water following me, close enough that every time I shifted or paused, the kayak would shiver under another subtle bump. I dared not look over the edge at first, afraid of what I might see, but the memory of the sudden thump forced me to glance down. The water was a dark, roiling shadow, and I could see the faint outline of something large moving slowly beneath the surface, turning in tandem with me. My mind tried to rationalize it, an enormous fish, maybe, or a submerged log, but the weight, the deliberate tracking, it didn't make sense. Whatever it was aware of me, and I could not convince myself otherwise. Panic set in fully. My breathing grew fast and shallow. I paddled harder, moving closer to the edge where the cliff gave way to a narrow strip of muddy shore. Each time I tried to angle toward a safer spot, the water would swell unnaturally under me. The kayak nudged sideways again. I felt my heart in my throat, my knuckles white around the paddle. My thoughts scrambled. What if it knocked me in? What if I couldn't reach the shore before it did? I didn't even care about fishing anymore. I just wanted to get out. Finally, after what felt like a long, torturous time, I reached the shore. The kayak scraped against mud, and I jumped out, cold water soaking my pants and shoes. I dragged it higher onto the bank, then turned to look back at the water. The surface was calm again, smooth, reflecting the cliffs in the late afternoon sun, as if nothing had happened. But I knew differently. My heart was still racing, my legs trembling. I didn't linger. I grabbed my gear, sloshed through the mud, and climbed back up the steep path toward my car, not daring to look back until I was several hundred yards away. By then, I could feel my pulse slowly returning to normal, but a knot remained in my stomach. I didn't speak, didn't stop, just kept moving until the distant sound of my car engine started, giving me a small, grounded sense of safety. The next day, curiosity gnawed at me. I returned to the quarry, this time on foot, careful and cautious. I approached the water's edge, scanning the rocks and the muddy bank. And there they were, marks carved into the stone long, deep scratches that looked as if something with strong claws had pressed against the rock and dragged downward repeatedly. They were smeared and weathered, but unmistakable. I ran my fingers lightly over them, feeling the grooves, the uneven texture. My stomach dropped. Whatever had brushed the kayak yesterday had been real, had been strong enough to leave its presence behind. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it away, and the thought of returning alone made my skin crawl. I left the quarry for the last time that day. The car felt warm and secure in the early autumn sun, a stark contrast to the black water and towering cliffs behind me. I didn't fish again for weeks after that, and when I did, it was at crowded lakes with other people nearby, the kind of water where shadows were predictable and nothing large could follow silently beneath the surface. I never went back to the forgotten quarry, and I have never tried to discover what exactly I had encountered. The scratches, the thump against the kayak, the pressure of the water moving just beneath me, all of it stayed vivid in my memory, a reminder that some places are abandoned for a reason, and that even in daylight, the quiet can hide something enormous and unpredictable. The story of the monster trout is probably just that, a story, but the evidence, the feel of it pressing against me, is real. I carry it with me every time I fish, a quiet caution that keeps my eyes on the water and my instincts sharp, and I am grateful for it. The air was thick with humidity when I pushed my kayak off the muddy bank into the shallow water of the bayou. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink as the sun dipped lower behind the moss-draped trees, their long, dangling tendrils swaying gently in the warm evening breeze. I could hear the distant hum of insects and the occasional splash of water as something disturbed the surface, likely a fish or a turtle. I had joined my friend for a weekend of fishing, mostly for largemouth bass, but also to escape the constant noise of the city. The bayou was remote, almost empty, and I felt that satisfying sense of isolation that only comes when the world outside your little bubble seems impossibly far away. I had gone a little slower than him, letting him pull ahead. My paddle sliced through the thick water with a soft, wet hiss. Every so often, I would pause, letting the kayak drift for a moment, just to listen. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves mixed with the faint, salty tang of the water. A smell that reminded me of all the afternoons I had spent on smaller lakes, but somehow heavier, more potent. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the surface, making every ripple and reflection seem more complex, almost alive. At first, the water was quiet except for the occasional splash of my paddle. I could see tiny fish flickering near the surface, and my lure swung lazily behind me. Then, I noticed something, a ripple against the current, small at first, just a subtle disturbance that might have been my imagination. I told myself it was nothing, probably a fish. I had been fishing in lakes and rivers for years, and I knew the water could play tricks on your mind. I leaned forward to paddle again, and the sound came, water slapping against something, uneven and heavy, unlike the small splashes of bass. I froze. For a moment, I thought my friend had stopped to cast a line, but his kayak was far ahead, and I should have heard the faint scrape of his paddle or the movement of his motorless vessel. This was different, too consistent, too deliberate. My stomach tightened. The bayou was getting darker. The sun had gone lower, shadows merging into black streaks across the water, and the moss seemed to hang heavier, brushing the surface as though reaching down. I tried to focus on my paddling, to convince myself that whatever it was would pass. My paddle struck the water in slow, deliberate strokes, and the kayak moved a few feet forward. Then I saw it. A pair of eyes, low to the water, reflecting the dim light, moving with the current, but keeping pace with me. They were small, amber, unnaturally still for a fish, and they made my pulse spike. I had read about alligators and snakes in the bayou, but nothing prepared me for seeing eyes that didn't belong to anything I could identify, at least not immediately. I scanned the water around me. The current was murky, brown with sediment, and I could just make out a shadow, sleek and wide, moving under the surface, following the kayak. Panic hit, not a loud, flailing panic, but a sharp, cold spike of fear that gripped my chest. I tried to paddle faster, but every stroke seemed slow, as if the water itself resisted me. The shadow stayed just beneath the surface, silent except for the occasional brushing of something against the bottom of the kayak. I could feel vibrations through the hull, subtle but unmistakable. My mind raced. It had to be an alligator. That made sense. Maybe it was following me, curious, maybe hungry. But the way it stayed close without lunging, the way it mirrored my movements, made every instinct in me scream. The bayou narrowed as I moved, and the trees seemed to press closer to the water, their roots twisting into the shallows. I kept my eyes fixed on the shadow, which now felt impossibly close, gliding beside me, under the paddle. My breaths were shallow. I could feel my heart hammering in my ears, louder than any sound from the bayou around me. I told myself to keep calm, to think logically. There were no other kayakers, no boats, no other people. It was just me and whatever it was. Minutes dragged on. I paddled, trying to put distance between myself and the shadow. I tried not to make sudden movements, knowing that any splashing could trigger an attack. Every now and then, the water would shift against the kayak, a brush of movement against my leg or the side, and I had to clamp down on the rising panic. I remembered my friend up ahead, and I thought of trying to call out, but my voice would carry too far and probably do nothing. The current seemed slower than usual, thick and sticky with mud. Every stroke felt like pushing through syrup. Finally, the bayou opened into the main channel, wider, deeper, calmer. The shadow had stayed with me all the way, but as the water opened, it slowed. I paused, letting the kayak drift. The eyes were gone, nothing remained but ripples spreading outward, and the disturbed water in my wake. Mud swirled up from the bottom, floating in grayish clouds. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than an alligator, or maybe a large catfish, a creature curious but not dangerous enough to attack. My legs were trembling, and I realized I had been gripping the paddle like it was the only thing keeping me alive. By the time I reached the bank near the main channel, the sun had fully set. The sky was dark, the water almost black, and the trees cast long, shifting shadows across the bayou. My friend had stopped further down, pulling in his line, unaware of what had been following me. I tied my kayak and climbed out, letting my feet sink into the thick, wet mud. Every sound was sharper in the darkness. The rustle of leaves, the distant splash of fish, the croak of frogs. I sat for a moment, listening to the bayou settle around me, feeling the adrenaline drain slowly from my body. My imagination had run wild, but the shadow, the eyes, the constant brushing of water against my kayak had been real. It didn't matter what it was, just knowing it had been there, moving beside me in the dark, was enough. My friend asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I didn't speak. Words felt unnecessary. The bayou had shown me a small, intimate slice of its danger, something human awareness could not fully anticipate. When we paddled back to the truck later, the air was cooler. I kept looking over my shoulder at the water, half expecting to see the shadow following us, but the bayou was calm, reflective, almost indifferent. The memory of those amber eyes stayed with me long after, a reminder that even familiar waters hold surprises, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing is not being attacked, but being watched, pursued by something you cannot name, something that moves as silently and purposefully as the current itself. I didn't speak about it again that weekend, and I haven't told anyone the details since. I don't need to. The bayou taught me enough. It doesn't reveal itself to everyone, but for those who linger too long, too far behind, it leaves a mark. I can still feel the water brushing the side of my kayak, the amber glow beneath the surface, and the sharp, undeniable certainty that I was not alone. The air was still and cool when I launched my small aluminum boat onto the Missouri River, the kind of early spring morning that feels both fragile and endless. The sun was just beginning to lift above the horizon, a faint orange glow brushing the edges of the clouds and reflecting off the wide, slow-moving water. I had waded through weeks of restless nights and quiet dinners alone, recovering from a breakup that had left the apartment too big and the silence too heavy. I needed space, a stretch of river to think without interruption, to hear my own thoughts more clearly than the ones bouncing around inside my head. Fishing seemed like the perfect excuse, though really it was just a way to get out, to move slowly through a world that felt far too loud when I stayed home. I tied the boat loosely to a snag near the riverbank and climbed in, letting the current nudge me downstream a little before pushing off with the paddle. The water was almost glassy, disturbed only by the occasional ripple from a passing fish or a subtle breeze brushing against the surface. The smell of damp earth and melting river ice lingered in the air, sharp and clean. I set up my rod, attaching a simple rig for catfish and baiting the hook with a chunk of cut shad. I let it sink slowly into the dark water, listening to the line settle and feeling the tug of gravity as it drifted out into the current. The river was quiet in that way that can feel both welcoming and isolating. Every sound seems exaggerated, yet muted at the same time. The occasional bird call bounced across the water, distant and hollow. A heron swept low, its wings skimming the surface, then disappeared into the rising sunlight. I settled onto the bench in the boat, leaning forward slightly, arms resting on my knees, eyes tracing the opposite bank. The riverbank was lined with tall grasses, willows bending toward the water, their roots exposed and darkened by spring floods. I had been fishing that stretch before, years back, and I remembered how calm it usually was. Today felt different. The light was warmer, the water more reflective, and yet there was a weight to the scene I couldn't place. I cast again, letting the bait drift with the current, and noticed a dark shape along the far bank. At first, I assumed it was a fallen log, the shadow of a tree bent at a strange angle. But as I watched, the shape moved in a way that made my stomach tighten. It didn't lift or shift like a person. It didn't crawl upright. It slithered a low, gliding motion along the mud and debris at the water's edge, too fluid and deliberate to be driftwood or a clump of brush. I froze, watching my line twitch slightly in the current. My heart had begun to thud, loud in the still morning, though I kept my body as still as I could. The dark figure remained on the opposite bank, moving slowly but steadily, keeping to the shadowed parts of the trees and reeds. I could make out the shape better now, long, dark, and thick, impossibly so, tapering slightly at one end but mostly uniform. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a beaver, a log jam with ice caught around it, a river otter gone unusually large. None of it made sense. I felt my hands tighten on the paddle, my other hand brushing against the rod. The line jerked violently, pulling toward the opposite bank with a force I had never felt before. My first instinct was to reel in, but the pull was too strong, almost dragging the boat slightly. Whatever was at the end of the line had grabbed hold with an intensity that didn't belong to any ordinary fish. The boat rocked gently as I struggled for a moment, my mind racing. The figure on the bank had stopped moving, as if it were observing, waiting. I could see the sunlight catching patches of wet mud along its surface, though I still could not tell if it was animal or an accumulation of river debris. I swallowed hard. I wasn't the kind of person to panic easily, not on the river, not with a rod in hand. I had spent hours alone before, sometimes days, carrying nothing but a cooler, tackle, and the occasional sandwich. But this was different. There was something about the deliberate gliding motion, the way the line had jerked in my hands, that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. It wasn't human, it wasn't fish, it wasn't anything I could place, and it refused to fit into the orderly, predictable patterns of the river I knew. I tried to reel it slowly, telling myself there was a snag, a submerged tree or root that had caught the line. The boat shivered against the small current, my paddle dipping nervously into the water to keep my balance. I thought about standing, about trying to get a better look, but my instincts screamed otherwise. The figure remained motionless now, dark against the mud and reeds, watching. I could feel the weight of it even across the river, the suggestion of something enormous and low, impossible to ignore. My heart pounded, but my breathing slowed, deliberate, shallow, as I weighed my options. Stay and investigate, or retreat before curiosity turned into danger. I made the decision quickly, because some part of me knew that hesitation might be fatal. I grabbed the paddle, shoved off from the snag, and began to row. Not carefully, not slowly. I paddled hard, the water slapping against the sides of the boat, leaving my gear behind in the chaos of my retreat. The line trailed behind, floating half in, half out of the water, still tugging as though whatever had been on the bank didn't want to let go. My arms burned, my heart threatened to burst, but I didn't stop until the familiar curve of the river brought me close to a bend I recognized, where I had left my car. I pulled the boat onto the gravel, hauling myself out and leaving the gear abandoned. I didn't look back, though I could feel the memory of the dark figure pressing against my mind. and I kept moving until I was safely on the road, the early sun warm on my back, and the river disappearing behind a bend of trees. Weeks later, I asked some locals about that stretch, about the opposite bank where I had seen the dark figure. They exchanged quiet looks and told me it wasn't unusual for people to report strange creatures, large catfish, submerged logs that move in unusual ways, but no one had ever caught anything. They referred to it as a place with river monsters, though they laughed softly at the term, the kind of laugh that holds memory and unease both. I never went back. I never retrieved my gear. I couldn't, not after what I had seen, not after the calm morning had turned into a pulse of fear that lingered in my chest for weeks. The river, once a place of solace, had become a reminder that even familiar landscapes could harbor surprises, and that sometimes the unknown waits silently at the edge of your vision, patient and deliberate, until the moment you notice it is also the moment you decide to leave. Even now, when I think about that morning, the sunrise still looks beautiful, the river still calm, but in the back of my mind, I can see the dark shape on the opposite bank, gliding with the weight and purpose that made me run. And I understand why some places on this river are left alone, why some stretches are whispered about but rarely approached. The memory is vivid, the fear real, and the lesson clear. Some solitude comes with boundaries, and some mornings demand you respect them. I had been driving through northern Michigan for most of the afternoon, winding up narrow back roads lined with thick pine and birch, looking for abandoned structures to photograph. It was summer, but the air carried a hint of early autumn chill, and the sunlight fell in thin shafts through the trees. I spotted the lake on a map the night before, a small private body of water with no public access, which made it ideal for what I was doing. A note in a photography forum mentioned an old dock somewhere along the east shore, rotting and half-submerged. I liked the idea of combining my photography with some quiet fishing, so I loaded a small canoe into the back of my car and drove as far as the road would take me, leaving the last mile to be walked through a narrow, overgrown path. The path to the lake was rough. Tall grass brushed my legs, and the trunks of pine trees leaned over at odd angles, creating patches of shade that felt cooler than the sunlit clearings. When I finally broke through to the water, the lake opened in front of me like a mirror. It was smaller than I imagined, but the water was so clear that I could see all the way to the sandy bottom. The dock was only a few dozen feet ahead, sticking crookedly out into the water. Some of the boards had completely collapsed, and moss clung to the remaining planks. I slid the canoe into the water with a quiet scrape, and it floated easily. The current was nearly non-existent, and there was no wind. Even the usual sounds of birds and insects felt muted, as though the lake absorbed them. I tied the canoe to what was left of the dock, testing the boards before stepping onto them. Each creaked under my weight, and one section sagged enough that I had to step over it. I unpacked my camera bag, leaving it at the far end of the dock, and grabbed my fishing gear. I was using light tackle, hoping to catch smallmouth bass near the submerged pilings. The water was unusually clear, and I could see fish darting in and out of the shadows of the rotting wood. Casting felt almost meditative, the line cutting through the calm air and landing with a soft plunk. After a few minutes, I noticed a strange chill creeping up my legs. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the air was still. Then I realized it was coming from the water. I looked down, and the temperature seemed to drop as though the lake itself was colder near the dock. I could feel it through my jeans, cold and sudden, and my skin prickled. That was when I felt something move under the dock. Something brushed against the supports below me. It wasn't a fish, not at the size and speed of the movement. It felt deliberate, as though something had shifted, testing the boards I stood on. My heart rate increased, but I told myself it was probably a snapping turtle or a log caught in the weeds. I tried to focus on fishing, casting near another piling, but the feeling persisted. Every time I adjusted my position, I felt a cold rush along my legs, and the water beneath me seemed to move differently than the rest of the lake. It wasn't a wave. It was localized, like something large sliding beneath the dock. I glanced behind me, just in time to see a dark shape slip under the water. My mind jumped to a human figure, but I told myself it had to be a deer or a fallen branch. There was no logical explanation for the sudden chill that pulsed in the water beneath my legs. The tension grew steadily. My line barely moved, but I couldn't focus on fishing anymore. I could hear nothing except the faint creak of the dock and the occasional splash of a fish. But those small sounds felt distant, muffled by a weight pressing down on the air. The shadows of the boards stretched across the water, and every time a breeze passed, the reflection of the trees shimmered oddly. I knew it was my imagination, but the sensation of being watched became nearly overwhelming. I slid my camera into the canoe, hoping to distract myself with photographs. I lifted it slowly, scanning the dock and water, but every image captured only the familiar rotting wood and clear water. Nothing unusual appeared. I realized I had been standing too long, frozen by the cold rush and the movement beneath the dock. I pushed off the dock carefully, slipping the canoe free, and paddled toward the shore, keeping my movements deliberate but quick. The canoe cut through the still water without a sound. Each stroke felt heavy, as if the lake itself resisted my escape. I glanced behind, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a large humanoid shape crouched beneath the dock, moving with the water. It disappeared the next second, leaving nothing but clear water and shadow. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to breathe slowly. Back on the shore, I set the canoe down and examined my camera. There was nothing in the photos that suggested anything had been there. No shape in the water, no figure among the dock supports, nothing that could account for the sensation that had gripped me. I replayed the images over and over, but each showed only the quiet, empty lake. The cold, the brush beneath the dock, the fleeting shape, it all existed only in memory, in the body's response to something unseen but very real. I left the lake quickly, carrying both camera and fishing gear back along the narrow path. The forest seemed denser, the shadows longer, but the sun still fell normally through the trees. I kept expecting to hear something behind me, a snap of a branch or a splash in the water, but there was nothing. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking slightly from the lingering chill and adrenaline. I sat for a moment, staring at the lake across the clearing, and realized that the memory of the cold, the movement under the dock, and the sense of being watched would not fade soon. Driving back along the quiet roads, I thought about what I had experienced. There was no supernatural force, no monster hiding in the shadows. The lake was private, the dock abandoned, and yet the reaction it produced in me had been undeniable. It was entirely human, a mixture of instinct, fear, and the uncertainty of an environment slightly out of control. I remembered every detail clearly. The creaking boards, the clarity of the water, the cold that seemed to rise from below, and the dark shape that may have been only a trick of the eye. I told myself the lake and dock would continue to exist in that quiet, decaying state for years, waiting for the next person to stumble into the same strange feeling I had. That night, I reviewed the photographs once more. Each one was beautiful in its own way. The decayed wood, the reflection of the trees, the stillness of the water, but none of them captured the tension, the brush of cold along my legs, or the instinctive panic. And yet, the memory stayed with me, more vivid than any image. I realized some experiences cannot be fully explained or captured. Some things are not meant to be photographed. I had gone there for pictures and fishing, but what stayed with me was the sensation of being present in a place alive with quiet, hidden movement. The lake itself felt aware, not as a conscious entity, but as a combination of shadow, water, and decay that could provoke a response beyond rational understanding. I have returned to lakes before and after that day, but I have avoided abandoned docks. Not because of superstition, but because I remember the cold, the sudden pressure of movement beneath me, and the instinctive knowledge that I had been part of something larger and unknowable. The lake was empty of life above the water, but the memory of the sensation beneath the dock lingers as though it is still there, just out of sight. I can think about it now without panic, but I will never forget the feeling of standing on that rotting dock, knowing something moved below, unseen but undeniably present, in a quiet, private lake in northern Michigan. I remember that night on the Susquehanna River with a clarity that has stayed with me, probably because it was the first time I understood how small and unprepared I really was for nature. We were a group of 4, all in our early 20s, barely experienced in night fishing. The idea seemed simple enough. Grab a couple of rods, some tackle, and head to a quiet bend of the river where the current was strong, a place that seemed perfect for catfish. None of us had been there before, and none of us had done night fishing seriously. But the thought of the challenge and the thrill of being out under the stars drew us in. The drive out was quiet except for the sound of the tires crunching over the gravel roads, and the occasional laugh or comment about how big the fish were probably going to be. I had the sense of excitement that comes from doing something slightly reckless but harmless, and that night, it felt endless, as if the hours were ours to fill however we wanted. When we arrived, the river was almost black. The water glimmered faintly under the moonlight, but the bend we had chosen was in shadow, bordered by a small cliff on one side and trees that leaned over the water on the other. The current moved faster than I expected, churning and swirling around submerged rocks, throwing brief patterns of reflected light onto the surface. We set up our lines along the edge, the bobbers barely visible against the dark water, and I remember feeling a strange quiet settle over everything, like the river had swallowed all sound except for our breathing and the occasional splash from fish stirring beneath the surface. At first, it was slow. The night was thick, and even though the moon was out, it did little to cut through the dark that pressed against the water and the cliff. I could hear my friends moving behind me, the soft scrape of boots against dirt and the occasional metallic clink of tackle. Every so often, one of them would yell something like, "Got a bite," and I'd see the faint shimmer of a bobber snapping to life before fading again. I tried to focus on my line, on the water, on the quiet rhythm of waiting. It was soothing in a way, almost meditative, but there was an underlying tension in the air, a sense of being entirely alone despite being with others. Around midnight, something changed. My line tightened suddenly, heavier than anything I'd felt before. The rod bent almost double, and I felt the pull in my hands, a resistance that made me stumble backward on the wet ground. The cliff loomed beside me, and my footing was uncertain. I tried to steady myself, but the bank was slippery from dew and loose soil, and the moment I braced my feet, they gave way. I slipped. The water hit hard and cold, sucking the breath from me for a second. I surfaced quickly, gasping, struggling to find the current, and I realized immediately that it was stronger than I had anticipated. It pushed against me, tossing me sideways, and I instinctively tightened my grip on the rod. The current carried me downstream, and I could barely keep my head above water. I kicked and paddled, trying to steer toward the bank, but it seemed impossible. My lungs burned, my arms ached, and the rod, already bending under the weight of whatever was on the line, felt like it might snap at any moment. Then I noticed it, a shadow moving with me. At first, I thought it was another swimmer, one of my friends who had come to help, but the shape was too large, too fluid, moving with a force that matched the current. I couldn't see it clearly, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the immediate circle of my flashlight, but the motion was enough to make my chest tighten. I tried to yell, but my voice was swallowed by the rushing water and the distance between us. I fought with everything I had. The river clawed at my legs and chest, dragging me against rocks and submerged branches. The shadow stayed close, moving with the rod, as if it were part of the river itself. Panic set in, sharp and consuming, and yet I could not let go. Letting the rod go meant losing the line, but more than that, it was the only thing keeping me from being completely at the mercy of the current. My friends' shouts were distant now, fragmented, and I couldn't tell which direction to aim for the bank. Every second felt like an eternity, every stroke of my arms pulling against a river that refused to release me. Somehow, through sheer desperation, I managed to angle myself toward the bank. My hands were numb, my fingers raw from gripping the rod, but I clawed at the muddy slope, dragging myself out of the water with the last bit of energy I had. I collapsed on the wet ground, coughing, shivering, drenched from head to toe. The rod was in pieces beside me, snapped at the center, the reel dangling uselessly. I stared at it for a moment, incredulous, trying to process what had just happened. Whatever had taken the rod, whatever had tugged with that incredible strength, was gone now, but the memory of the force, the unrelenting pull, was etched into my muscles and my mind. My friends rushed to me, their expressions a mixture of concern and disbelief. They had seen some of what happened from the bank, but not enough to explain it. None of us spoke immediately. We just sat there, dripping and exhausted, listening to the river gurgle past. Eventually, we collected ourselves and managed to gather our remaining gear, moving back up the small path to where we had parked. The silence on the way back was heavier than any conversation could have been. After that night, the river bend took on a different meaning for me. I couldn't return for years without remembering the weight of the water, the way it seemed to pull at something larger than myself, the strange heaviness that had accompanied the line. It was a simple river, unremarkable in daylight, but at night, it became something entirely different, an element that reminded me how unprepared we were, how small we really were in comparison to the current and the sheer force of the world around us. We never talked much about it afterward, only exchanged brief comments when the topic of fishing came up. The rod was gone, never replaced, a casualty of that night, and the memory lingered sharper than anything else. I could never explain it fully, the size of the pull, the shadow that moved with me, but it didn't need explanation. It was enough to know that we had faced the river as it was, unyielding, indifferent, and vast, and that for a few minutes I had been entirely at its mercy. The incident left me with a caution I carry still, a respect for the quiet power of water and the fragility of our human certainty. The river bend at night is no longer a spot for thrill-seeking. It is a place I remember for the weight of the current, the cold of the water, and the humbling sense of survival. I left Portland just before dawn on a Saturday in early May, hoping to beat the traffic and get a quiet morning at Crescent Lake. The drive was easy at first, winding through the outskirts of the city, past stretches of farmland, and then climbing into dense forest roads. By the time I parked at the small dirt pullout near the lake, the sky was just beginning to lighten, a thin gray overcast giving everything a soft, muted edge. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, cool but not cold, carrying the faint tang of water from the lake itself. I slipped my backpack over my shoulders, grabbed my tackle box, and carried my aluminum rod down the narrow path to the shoreline. Crescent Lake is small, maybe 200 yards across at its widest point, bordered by thick evergreens that leaned close to the water, casting irregular shadows even in the early light. The surface was perfectly still, glassy except for tiny concentric ripples near the far edge where reeds brushed the water. No wind, no birds yet, just the muffled sound of a few early insects. I set down my gear, took a deep breath, and assembled the rod. I had my usual crappy setup, light line, a small jig tipped with a minnow, a reel that was smooth but familiar. The first cast went almost silently through the air, the lure landing with a soft plop near the middle of the lake. I watched the line for a moment, letting it settle. The water stayed calm. I felt the cool mud squish under my sneakers as I adjusted my stance. Then, just at the edge of my vision, the surface of the lake shimmered, not a wave or wind ripple but a slow, deliberate undulation, moving in arcs outward as if something had brushed the water below. I squinted, expecting to see a fish breaking the surface, but nothing appeared. The stillness returned, and I assumed it was my imagination. I waited a few moments, then cast again, landing closer to the center this time. Seconds later, the rod jerked violently, so hard I almost dropped it. I tightened my grip, heart racing, and began reeling in, expecting a heavy crappie or maybe a bass. The resistance was wrong, too heavy, too constant, and moving in a way that didn't match the behavior of a normal fish. The line tugged steadily, not darting, not jerking like a crappie would. The drag on the reel hummed against my hand as I pulled, and then I felt it. Something brushing against my legs in the shallow water, a long, leathery touch that slid along my calves and ankles. My stomach tightened, and my hand froze on the rod. The water rippled again in circles around my feet. I spun around, scanning the lake, the shoreline, every shadow between the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no silhouette, nothing to explain what had just brushed against me. I backed up instinctively, pulling the rod with me, eyes fixed on the water. The feeling returned for a moment, lighter this time, a brush along my ankle, then gone. My first instinct was to convince myself it was a snag, a submerged log or branch. But the way it moved, sliding against me in the shallow water, made it impossible to believe it was just a stick. I could feel my chest tighten with panic as I packed up my gear quickly, tossing the rod into the backpack, shoving the tackle box on top. My hands shook, though I tried to steady them, moving faster than necessary down the path back toward my car. The forest seemed different on the way back, heavier somehow, the shadows longer, darker, even with the gray morning light filtering through the trees. Every small sound, the snapping of a branch, a bird calling, made me pause. My steps became uneven as I reached the clearing where I had parked, scanning the edges of the lake in case whatever had been there was still visible. It was perfectly still again, quiet in a way that felt almost oppressive, the water reflecting the forest in perfect symmetry. Nothing to show that anything had been there at all, except the lingering adrenaline in my body and the memory of the brush against my skin. Driving back down the narrow forest road, I tried to think through what had happened. I kept imagining submerged logs, maybe a large muskrat or otter, anything that would make sense. But the touch had been broad, heavier than any small animal, sliding across my ankle, and then gone without a trace. I could still feel it, like the memory of it lingered in my muscles. By the time I reached the first highway back toward the city, I had slowed, gripping the steering wheel, unwilling to replay the moment, but unable to dismiss it completely. When I got home, I searched online for Crescent Lake, curious if anyone had reported strange fish or wildlife. Most of the articles were about fishing conditions, the usual crappie and bass counts, but tucked into forum threads and comment sections were vague mentions of something locals called the giant catfish. People didn't say much, just warnings like keep your line short, or don't fish at the edge where the old tree roots hang underwater. No one claimed to have seen anything clearly, just anecdotes about strong pulls, strange ripples, or lines disappearing in the middle of the night. It wasn't horror or folklore, just small, cautious statements, almost embarrassed to exist at all. I realized later that the lake's remoteness contributed to the strangeness. There was little human activity, no boats, no loud noises to disturb whatever lived there. In a body of water that small, a large catfish, or any large creature, would move quietly, almost invisibly. The brush of something against my leg, the way the water had rippled, the sheer resistance on my line, all of it suddenly made sense. Not supernatural, not a story to tell at parties, just a reality I hadn't accounted for. Sometimes small lakes hide creatures much larger than expected, and sometimes the calmest water is hiding the strongest pull. I went back a few weeks later, in daylight, to see if I could make sense of it. The lake looked completely ordinary. Sunlight danced on the surface, birds called from the trees, minnows skittered at the edge. I waded carefully along the same spot, feeling for submerged roots or logs. There was nothing, just mud and water. I never felt that sliding brush again, but I didn't stay long. I caught a few crappie further out in the middle, lines tight with ordinary fish, nothing extraordinary. Still, I didn't linger. The memory of the first morning lingered, a quiet unease that made me move deliberately with caution whenever I returned to any isolated lake. The incident stayed with me, not as a story of monsters or supernatural horror, but as a reminder of the lake's real, unremarkable danger. Crescent Lake seemed harmless, quiet, almost idyllic, but for that single morning it had reminded me that nature is larger, stronger, and far less predictable than my assumptions allowed. The crappie I had come for were insignificant in comparison to the reminder that a calm, hidden lake can conceal something big, patient, and entirely indifferent to a human's presence. I never fish that shoreline again, and whenever I drive past forested lakes now, I remember that morning and the brush against my leg, and I leave the water to whatever waits below, undisturbed and unseen. It wasn't a story anyone would believe, and I didn't try to convince anyone. It was real, and that was enough. I had borrowed my uncle's canoe on a crisp October morning, eager to escape the noise of the small town where he lived. Upstate New York in autumn had a quiet that felt almost sacred, and I wanted to fish alone in the private reservoir he had always spoken of but rarely visited himself. The drive to the property had been long, winding along narrow roads lined with trees already burning in reds and golds. When I pulled into the small clearing near the water, the only sounds were the distant hum of the wind through the branches and the occasional rustle of squirrels gathering nuts. The reservoir itself was smaller than I had imagined, tucked into a shallow valley surrounded by dense woods. The water lay still and glassy, reflecting the sky and the riot of fall colors with the precision of a mirror. It looked inviting and calm, almost untouched. I carried the canoe down to the water, carefully sliding it into the shallow bank where reeds brushed the sides. The moment I settled in, the smell of damp leaves and wet soil filled my nose. The air was sharp and cool, carrying the faint scent of decaying vegetation, and the silence pressed against my ears in a way that made me hyper-aware of every small sound. The occasional drip of water from a low-hanging branch, the call of a distant bird, the faint rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. I pushed off gently, letting the canoe drift toward the center, and began to cast my line. The reel spun smoothly, the lure cutting a perfect arc before landing with barely a splash. For the first hour, nothing moved. I drifted slowly, letting the wind guide me across the water. I watched leaves fall onto the surface, spinning in tiny eddies that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. The reflection of the surrounding trees in the water was perfect, the branches appearing to reach down into the depths. It was the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel significant. I could hear the faint slap of water against the canoe's hull when I adjusted my position, the soft swish of my paddle when I nudged it along the surface, and occasionally, the whisper of air as the wind changed direction. I told myself that the isolation was exactly what I wanted, that the silence was part of the draw, but even as I thought it, I felt a subtle tension in my shoulders. Then, as I reeled in a slow drift of the line, I felt something. A tug, not sharp, not like a fish, but firm enough to make my heart jump. I paused, letting the line rest, but the tug persisted. It was gentle, almost insistent, like someone was pressing against the end of the line. I lifted the rod slowly, watching the water around the lure, and that's when I noticed the circles. The ripples spread outward in perfect rings, concentric waves that didn't match the way water reacted when a fish disturbed it. They weren't large, maybe a foot or two across, but they were unnaturally uniform. I lowered the rod slightly, my skin prickling with a feeling I couldn't name, a quiet unease that grew heavier with each passing second. The first sound came faintly, almost drowned out by my own quickening heartbeat. A wet scraping along the side of the canoe, soft and intermittent, like something wet and rough brushing against the wood. I froze, listening. The scraping came again, closer now, moving along the hull in short bursts as if circling me. My mind ran through possibilities, fallen branches, small animals, the line catching on something underwater, but nothing I could see explained the pattern of sound. My hands tightened around the paddle, and I shifted to look over the side, peering into the dark water that reflected the sky but gave away no shapes beneath its surface. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I was imagining it, that the mind plays tricks in isolation, that a log or a submerged branch could account for the sensation. I paddled slowly back toward the dock, keeping my movements deliberate, trying not to attract attention from whatever was brushing against the canoe. The water felt suddenly colder as I moved, as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees in the shadows of the trees. Each pull of the paddle produced a soft slap against the hull, echoing in the quiet. When I reached the dock, I set the paddle down against the canoe to tie the bow. That's when I noticed it. The paddle itself bore a series of scratches, not deep but deliberate, forming a pattern that I couldn't identify. They were long and thin, spaced evenly along the shaft, almost like a code, though I knew it wasn't. The wood felt rough under my fingertips, and for a moment I considered the possibility that I had done it unconsciously, that some small motion had scraped it against the bottom or the dock. But the scratches didn't match any normal wear, and I was careful when using the paddle. I had never seen marks like them before. I stared at the scratches for several minutes, scanning the dock, the water, and the surrounding trees for anything that could explain it. Nothing moved. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling leaves and carrying the faint, earthy smell of wet soil. I ran my hand along the scratches again, feeling the slight groove in the wood, and a strange sense of exposure settled in my chest. I had been alone on the water, in a place I thought I knew, and yet I realized how little I actually understood about it. The reservoir, so inviting and serene, had revealed a quiet vulnerability I hadn't anticipated. I packed the canoe slowly, examining the scratches one last time before lifting it from the water and carrying it back up the path. The sun had moved lower, casting longer shadows that stretched across the forest floor. Each step felt heavier, the weight of unease pressing against the calm I had expected to feel. When I reached my uncle's house, I set the canoe down carefully, cleaned the paddle, and looked out the window at the reservoir. The water was smooth again, reflecting the evening sky as though nothing had happened. I thought about the scratches often afterward. I never saw anything again in that reservoir, never felt the tug on the line, or heard the scraping on the hull. Yet every time I remembered it, the memory was vivid. The way the water had moved unnaturally, the sound that had seemed to track the canoe, the strange pattern on the paddle. I never returned to that reservoir alone. I went back with my uncle once, just to fish from the bank, and even then I stayed close to the shore. The isolation that had drawn me in the first place had revealed its other side, a reminder that even the quietest places hold surprises we can't anticipate. The scratches on the paddle remained for years, faint but permanent, a record of the day the reservoir had reminded me that solitude carries its own risks. I kept it on the wall of my garage, not as a trophy, but as a warning, a quiet memory of a place that was beautiful and still, and somehow not entirely empty. I drove down the narrow, winding roads along the James River, the air thick and humid from the summer heat. It was past 11 at night, and the streets leading to the riverbank were quiet, almost deserted. Only the occasional sound of crickets or the distant hum of a car on the highway broke the silence. My friend and I had decided at the last minute to fish at night. The idea had started as a casual joke at work, a way to get out and feel a little thrill without doing anything truly reckless. None of the others wanted to come. They said it was too late, too risky, too much effort. It left the two of us, a cooler with bait, our rods, and the faint sense that we were about to do something unusual, maybe a little stupid. We parked near the old launch ramp, the metal grating cold under my fingers as I pulled my gear out of the trunk. The river was mostly dark, a flat, almost black surface that reflected only the scattered light of the moon and our weak flashlights. The air smelled like wet earth and algae, heavy and tangy. There was a low hum from the water itself, subtle under the surface, like the river was breathing slowly. We unloaded our tackle boxes and set up a small space near the edge where the grass met the water, careful not to make much noise. Every sound seemed louder than normal, the scrape of the cooler lid, the snap of the rod against the pavement, the rustle of weeds underfoot. I cast my line first, letting the lure sink into the water. The surface was still, except for the occasional ripple when a fish moved near the edge. My friend did the same, keeping his flashlight low, a weak circle of light that barely reached past the end of his rod. The night was quiet except for the soft clinking of the reels and the occasional call of a distant owl. I felt the calm settle over me, a mix of excitement and tension that only comes from being somewhere you know is completely removed from anyone else, in a place that exists outside of ordinary time. We had no intentions beyond fishing, but the darkness made everything feel charged, like the world had shrunk to only the river, the rods, and us. After what felt like an hour, my line jerked violently. Not a nibble or the slow tug of a base. It was a sudden, hard pull that yanked my arm backward. My body tensed immediately, the muscles in my forearm straining as I tried to maintain control. The rod bent sharply, almost double, and I could hear the strain in the reel as the drag screamed quietly. My mind raced with possibilities. I had hooked something heavy, something enormous, heavier than any bass I had ever caught. My friend leaned over to see what was happening, his flashlight angled toward my line, and in the same instant, it slipped from his hands and fell into the water. The light went out instantly, swallowed by the black surface. The river, already dark, seemed suddenly alive. In the faint glow of the moon, I caught a glimpse of a dark shape moving under the water, too tall and too straight to be a fish, too smooth and continuous to be driftwood. It shifted with the current, rising and falling in a way that made my stomach tighten. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, only that it was humanoid enough to be unsettling. My mind tried to rationalize it. Tree debris, a shadow from the bank, a reflection, but nothing fit. The shape stayed with the line, moving with a force that no ordinary fish could produce. My friend and I froze, gripping our rods, trying not to breathe too loudly, each second stretching in a way that made the night feel unending. Panic rose fast. The line jerked again, harder this time, pulling the rod almost out of my hands. I yanked back, but the resistance was immense, as though whatever it was wrapped itself around the lure and would not let go. My friend, still half limp from shock, grabbed my arm, and we stumbled backward, slipping in the mud at the river's edge. We didn't speak, didn't make a sound beyond the heavy thumping of our hearts. I realized the only rational thing to do was to get out of the water. Every instinct screamed at me to leave the line, leave the rods, leave everything, and run. We turned and ran up the bank, tripping over roots and rocks, our bare feet sinking slightly into the wet grass. In the pitch black, with nothing between us and the looming river, the shape stayed there, immobile now, under the surface, just a shadow in the water. It didn't chase us. It didn't move away. It simply existed, a presence I could not comprehend, not with light, not with reason. When we reached the truck, we didn't stop. We threw ourselves inside, doors slamming, and I couldn't shake the sight of that dark form under the surface. My hands shook as I started the engine. The quiet of the night returned slowly, but the image lingered. We left the rods, the tackle, the flashlight floating somewhere in the river. Nothing mattered except the drive back to the main road, the safe, lit streets of the town. By the time we were on asphalt again, I could feel the tension in my body begin to loosen, but only slightly. Something in the river had made the world feel fragile, uncertain, like a thin skin over something far larger and indifferent. The next morning, we returned. Daylight changed everything. The river looked ordinary, flat and calm, sunlight bouncing off the surface, the smell of mud replaced by dry grass and warm air. We retrieved our rods carefully, inspecting the lines. Everything seemed normal until I picked up the lure I had thought lost. The hook was bent into a perfect U-shape, a distortion too precise to have been accidental. It spoke to a force I could not explain, something with the strength to pull a rod and nearly drag me into the water, but nothing else remained. No footprints, no ripples beyond the usual current, nothing that could account for the previous night's encounter. The river gave nothing else away. We fished for a short while in daylight, the thrill gone, the lines heavier and slower, the bass cautious and predictable. The bend in the hook remained a silent testimony, a memory etched in metal. I kept it with me for months afterward, a reminder that some parts of nature were unknowable, that a river, familiar and calm in daylight, could transform entirely at night. I never returned to that exact spot after dark, and I never saw anything like that again. But every time I hear the James River, I remember the tug, the shadow beneath, and the cold certainty that whatever it was real, tangible, and perfectly content to remain unseen. I arrived at Lake Mendota just as the first hints of light were brushing the eastern horizon. Summer mornings in Wisconsin have a way of feeling both endless and fleeting, like the air itself is stretched thin over the water. I had left Madison before 5, wanting the lake to myself, hoping to catch walleye before the weekend crowds arrived. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the mist rising off the lake made everything quiet and still, almost sacred. I carried my small aluminum boat down to the water, feeling the chill of damp air against my skin, even though it was mid-July. There was no one around, no voices, only the distant sound of water lapping against the shore. I pushed the boat in and stepped aboard, feeling the metal shiver beneath my weight. The oars cut through the fog as I rowed into the center of the lake, each stroke slow and deliberate. The fog was dense, thick enough that I couldn't see more than a few yards in any direction. It muffled the sounds I expected to hear: the gulls, the splash of fish breaking the surface, even the distant hum of boats starting elsewhere on the lake. It was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, the kind of quiet that makes your own breathing seem loud. The water around the boat was glassy, smooth, reflecting the pale light of the sky. I stopped rowing and let the boat drift, adjusting the anchor line to hold me in a promising spot. My eyes scanned the water, watching for any signs of movement. The usual flashes of small fish under the surface, ripples near the shoreline, none of it appeared. Then, almost imperceptibly, I saw shadows below me deeper in the water. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the fog, but the shapes moved, slow and deliberate, too large and dark to be ordinary fish. I held my breath and leaned closer, the aluminum cold under my hands. The shadows lingered beneath the boat, circling in a pattern that made my stomach tighten. I tried to dismiss it. Walleye can be bigger than I was used to, and the early morning light can distort their size and shape. I told myself it was nothing, that I'd spooked something harmless. I reached for my rod and cast out, trying to focus on the familiar rhythm of fishing. The line cutting through water, the occasional tug, the scent of wet metal and lake water filling my senses. But something about the lake felt different. The water seemed heavier, denser, pressing against the hull in a way I couldn't explain. Then it happened. The surface of the lake beside the boat erupted violently, water surging upward as if something massive had struck from below. I froze, heart hammering, straining to see through the fog, but there was nothing. No fish, no debris, no ripples spreading outward. The water was calm again, yet the boat seemed to shift, tilting ever so slightly as though something enormous was moving directly beneath it. My hands gripped the oars tighter. I tried to row back toward shore, but the first stroke met resistance. The oars struck nothing. It was as if the water itself was holding it down. My chest tightened, and a cold sweat ran down my back. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of the middle of the lake. I dug the other oar in, thrashing, but the same thing happened. The boat didn't tip, didn't move unnaturally, but I felt it, something massive, almost tangible beneath me, shifting with the rhythm of my panicked movements. I could feel the vibration through the aluminum, like a pressure that pressed against the bottom of the boat. I stopped, letting the oars float in the water, trying to understand what I was experiencing. The fog wrapped around me, obscuring everything, and the lake stretched endlessly in every direction. It was just me, the boat, and that overwhelming sensation beneath me. Minutes passed. I wasn't counting them, couldn't. My breathing came fast and shallow, my fingers numb from gripping the oars. The fog was beginning to lighten, the sun lifting higher, but that didn't help. Every instinct I had was screaming danger, yet there was no tangible threat I could see. I had fished this lake dozens of times, early in the morning, alone. I had never felt anything like this. The surface remained undisturbed, no waves, no splashes, only a weight pressing from below. Finally, I forced myself to row, slow and careful, toward the shore. Each stroke was tentative, testing the water, feeling for resistance. It was still there, sometimes strong, sometimes subtle, but I kept moving, leaning over to keep the oars as far from the boat's hull as possible. The fog began to lift more rapidly now, and I could make out the faint outlines of trees along the shore. Relief surged, and my body reacted, muscles trembling with exhaustion and fear. I rowed harder, faster, almost frantically, until the shoreline was close enough to grab with my hands. I hauled the boat onto the sand and collapsed beside it, soaked, shivering, staring at the water. The lake was calm again, serene even, as if nothing had happened. There were no footprints in the shallow sand, no disturbed wildlife, no sign of anything massive lurking beneath the surface. The shadows I had seen, the eruption, the weight beneath the boat, it made no sense. Rationally, I knew there was no creature in the lake, nothing unnatural. Lake Mendota is well mapped, well fished, and there are no animals large enough to create the sensation I had experienced. It had to be something else, a trick of the fog, my own fear magnifying every ripple, every shadow. I stayed there for a long time, sitting on the shore, letting my heartbeat slow, letting my eyes adjust to the light. I couldn't explain it, couldn't put words to it beyond the simple fact that the lake had felt alive in a way it never had before. It wasn't about fish or wildlife, it was about the presence of something enormous moving beneath me, so real I could feel it in my hands and under my feet. Eventually, I righted the boat, packed it up, and drove back to Madison in silence, replaying every detail, trying to make sense of it. I never returned to that exact spot on Lake Mendota, and I never fished alone at dawn in the fog again. Friends who know the lake tell me it can play tricks in heavy mist, that shadows and currents can create illusions, but that doesn't erase the memory of how real it felt. The weight under the boat, the impossible resistance against the oars, the moment when I understood that whatever it was massive, hidden, and patient. It was a summer morning, the sun rising over calm water, and I was more terrified than I had ever been, alone on a lake I thought I knew. Even now, every time I think about fishing on Lake Mendota at dawn, I picture that fog, the shadows beneath the boat, and I feel that same tightening in my chest, a reminder that some parts of the world are still unknowable, and that the lake keeps its secrets close to the surface.